Hello. Welcome back to Sleepless Veteran. If you're here to rest, to let your mind settle while learning something new, you've found the right place. We tell military history slowly, without urgency, without drama, just facts unfolding at a pace that lets you breathe, that lets you process, that lets you drift if you need to. Tonight, we're going beneath the surface, descending into the Pacific Ocean, into the dark waters where submarines operated during World War II. Specifically, we're following the Japanese submarine force. 174 submarines were commissioned during the war. These weren't small vessels. Were large fleet submarines mostly. Could cross the Pacific, could remain at sea for months. Were armed with torpedoes and deck guns. Were crewed by elite volunteers. Were among the most capable submarines in the world when the war began. But there's a number that defines their story. 80%. Of the 174 submarines commissioned, 139 were lost, never returned home. 80% of the force was destroyed. The crews, approximately 10,000 men, went down with their submarines. Most died without anyone knowing exactly how, without distress calls, without survivors, just disappeared beneath the waves. The submarines that left port on patrol and simply never came back. This is a story about descent, about submarines that dove beneath the surface and many never surfaced again, about crews that lived in steel tubes surrounded by ocean that would kill them instantly if the hull breached, about the gradual destruction of an entire force, about the mathematics of attrition, about how 80% came to be the number that defined the campaign, about how most Japanese submariners didn't survive the war, about how their submarines became their tombs. The story isn't dramatic in conventional sense, isn't about heroic last stands or famous battles, is about slow, systematic destruction, about submarines that left port knowing they probably wouldn't return, about crews that endured conditions that were brutal even before encountering the enemy, about a campaign that failed strategically but cost enormously in human terms, about men who fought and died in silence, beneath the surface, entombed in steel far below where anyone would find them. So settle in. Get comfortable. What follows is calm, is steady. We'll follow the life cycle of Japanese submarines, from commissioning to patrol to eventual loss. We'll understand what it meant to live inside a submarine in the Pacific. We'll see how the technological gap grew, how the Doctrine failed, how the losses accumulated, how 80% came to be lost, how 10,000 men came to die beneath the waves. This is the story of Japan's silent fleet, the submarines that went to sea. Most never returned, the crews that descended into darkness. Most remained there. Let's begin at the beginning, with the steel that went to sea, with the submarines when they were new, before the war showed what 80% meant, before the ocean claimed them, before they became the silent tombs they remain today. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed one of the world's largest submarine fleets when war began in December 1941. Approximately 63 submarines were in service. More would be commissioned as the war progressed. The total would reach 174 submarines by war's end. The fleet included various types: small coastal submarines, medium-range boats, large fleet submarines, specialized vessels designed for specific missions. The diversity reflected sophisticated naval planning, reflected understanding of submarine warfare, reflected Japan's status as major naval power. The I-class fleet submarines were the backbone, were largest and most capable. The designation I indicated first class, indicated main fleet units. These submarines were impressive vessels, exceeded 100 meters in length, displaced over 2,000 tons, could travel 20,000 kilometers without refueling, could remain at sea for 90 days, could operate anywhere in the Pacific. The range and endurance were exceptional, were among the best in the world. The Japanese submarine force was technologically advanced, was capable, was formidable. The armament was substantial. The main weapons were torpedoes. Type 95 torpedoes primarily for submarine use. 6 bow torpedo tubes typically. Carried approximately 20 torpedoes. Could engage surface vessels. Could engage other submarines. The deck gun supplemented the torpedoes. A 140-meter gun mounted forward of the conning tower. Could be used for surface engagements. Could bombard shore targets. Could sink merchant vessels without expending torpedoes. Some submarines carried aircraft. Small seaplanes for reconnaissance. Could be launched from deck. Could scout ahead. Could extend the submarine's effective range of observation. The capabilities were diverse, were sophisticated, were impressive. The crew numbered between 60 and 100 men, depending on submarine size. The I-class submarines typically had crews of 70 to 80. The crew was divided by function: the command section, the torpedo section, the engineering section, the radio and navigation section. Each section had specific duties, specific skills, specific responsibilities. The coordination between sections was essential, was practiced extensively, was refined through training. The crew operated as integrated unit, had to operate as unit. The submarine could not function otherwise. The selection standards were high. Submarine service was volunteer only. Not all volunteers were accepted. The physical requirements were strict. Had to pass medical examinations. Had to meet fitness standards. Had to demonstrate aptitude. The psychological requirements were stringent. Had to demonstrate stability. Had to show ability to handle stress. Had to prove capability for close quarters living. The training was rigorous, lasted months, covered technical skills, covered emergency procedures, covered combat tactics. The submariners who completed training were elite, were among the best personnel in the Navy, were professionals. The doctrine that governed their use was specific. Japanese submarines were intended as fleet auxiliaries, were to support the battle fleet. The concept was that major naval war would be decided by battleship engagement. The submarine's role was to reduce enemy strength before that engagement, to scout for the fleet, to attack enemy capital ships, to whittle down enemy numbers. The doctrine was clear, was taught, was emphasized. The submarines existed to support the surface fleet. This was their purpose. This was their mission. This was what they trained for. The strategic concept was based on pre-war planning. The expectation was that any naval war with the United States would follow predictable pattern. The American fleet would advance across the Pacific, would seek decisive engagement. The Japanese submarines would operate ahead of the Japanese fleet, would detect the American advance, would attack American capital ships, would reduce American strength. Then the Japanese battle fleet would engage, would defeat the weakened American fleet, would win the decisive battle. The concept was logical, was based on naval theory, was taught in naval academies, was accepted doctrine, but the concept had fundamental flaw. Assumed that naval war would be decided by surface engagement, assumed that submarines' primary value was supporting that engagement, assumed that attacking warships was optimal use of submarines. These assumptions would prove incorrect, would prove costly, would contribute to the campaign's failure. But in 1941, the assumptions were doctrine, were unquestioned, were how the Navy understood submarine warfare. The submarines that went to sea went with this doctrine, operated under these assumptions, would die following these principles. The submarines that were commissioned in 1941 and 42 were ready for war, were capable vessels, were well maintained, were crewed by trained professional submariners. The steel was sound, the machinery was functional, the weapons were effective, the crews were competent. Everything suggested that the Japanese submarine force would be a formidable opponent, would achieve significant success, would contribute meaningfully to the naval campaign. The potential was real, was evident in the capabilities, in the training, in the preparation. The submarines that went to sea in the war's early months were impressive force, were ready, were capable, were professional. But there was the number. 174 submarines would be commissioned total. 139 would be lost. 80% attrition rate. The submarines that went to sea in 1941 didn't know this. Couldn't know this. The future was unknown. The outcome was undetermined. The submarines departed on patrols, operated as trained, followed Doctrine, attempted to accomplish missions. Some would return. Some wouldn't. The pattern would establish itself gradually, would become clear only in retrospect, would reveal itself through accumulated losses, through submarines that left and didn't return, through crews that died, through steel that sank. The submarines went to sea. Most would not return. The steel that went to sea would remain at sea, would rest on the ocean floor, would become tombs for the men inside, would remain there still. The submarines were commissioned, were sent to war, were sent to sea, were sent to depths from which most would never return. The steel that went to sea, the submarines that descended, the crews that never came home. The 80%. The story begins here. With the steel, with the submarines, with the beginning. Before the losses, before the dying, before the descent that would be final. The steel that went to sea. The submarine I-168 was commissioned in July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor. The ceremony occurred at the Kure Naval Arsenal. The submarine was designated as Type KD-6A, was fleet submarine, displaced 1,900 tons, measured 97 meters in length, was powered by diesel engines on surface, by electric motors submerged, could travel 16,000 nautical miles, could remain at sea for 60 days, carried 6 torpedo tubes, carried 17 torpedoes, was armed with a 120mm deck gun, was capable vessel, was ready for service. The crew assembled for commissioning numbered 75 officers and men. The captain was Commander Tanabe Yahachi, was experienced officer, had served on submarines before, had completed submarine command course, was considered capable commander. The executive officer was Lieutenant Commander Ishikawa, was responsible for day-to-day operations, for crew management, for coordinating between sections. The torpedo officer was Lieutenant Nakagawa, commanded the torpedo room crew, was responsible for weapon readiness, for attack coordination, for maintenance of torpedoes and tubes. The engineering officer was Lieutenant Yamamoto, commanded the engine room crew, was responsible for propulsion, for electrical systems, for mechanical maintenance, for keeping submarine operational. The navigation officer was Lieutenant Junior Grade Sato, was responsible for navigation, for plotting courses, for determining position, for coordination with communications. The crew included petty officers and seamen assigned to specific sections, torpedo crews who loaded and maintained weapons, engine crews who operated and maintained machinery, electricians who maintained electrical systems, radio men who maintained communications, lookouts who watched for threats, cooks who prepared food. Each man had specific duties, specific skills, specific place in the crew. The commissioning ceremony was formal, was traditional. The crew assembled on deck in dress uniforms. The officers stood forward. The naval officials attended. The speeches emphasized duty, emphasized honor, emphasized service to the Emperor. The submarine was officially accepted into service, was designated I-168, was assigned to the 6th Fleet, the submarine fleet. The ceremony concluded. The crew remained aboard. The submarine was now active warship, was now home to 75 men, was now their world, their workspace, their battlefield, potentially their tomb. The first days after commissioning were shakedown. testing all systems, running on surface, diving, submerging to various depths, testing crush depth margins, running engines at various speeds, testing maneuverability. The crew practiced emergency procedures, practiced diving quickly, practiced damage control, practiced abandoning ship, though this was largely theoretical. Actually abandoning submerged submarine was nearly impossible. The procedures existed, but reality was that crew trapped in sunken submarine had minimal chance of escape. The training acknowledged this implicitly. The emphasis was on preventing disasters, not surviving them. The crew learned to live together. 75 men in confined space. The officers had small private cabins. Small meaning 2 meters by 1 meter. Enough for bunk and small desk. The crew had bunks in torpedo room and engine room. 3 high, hot bunked often. Shared bunks with different watch sections. One man sleeping while another worked. The personal space was minimal. Was essentially the bunk. Nothing more. The crew lived among machinery, among weapons, among everything. There was no separate living space, no recreation space, no privacy. The submarine was workplace, was home, was everything. The crew adapted, learned to coexist, learned to share space, learned to function in proximity, was necessary, was only way to survive psychologically. The food was good initially. Fresh food was loaded before departure. Vegetables, fruit, meat, fresh rice. The meals were prepared by designated cooks, were served in shifts. The crew ate in whatever space was available, often standing, often sitting on equipment. There was no dining room, no mess hall, just spaces between machinery where crew could eat. The food was important, was highlight of day, was break from routine, was moment of normalcy. The cooks were valued members of crew. Their skill directly affected morale. Good food made conditions more bearable. Poor food made everything worse. The routine was established through training. The watch schedule, 4 hours on, 8 hours off. The watches rotated through crew, ensured continuous operation. The watches included various duties. Lookout watch on surface, sonar watch submerged, engine watch, helm watch, radio watch. Each watch had specific responsibilities, specific stations. The crew learned the rhythm, learned to sleep in 4-hour increments, learned to eat when possible, learned to work tired, learned to function on insufficient sleep, was part of submarine life, was unavoidable, was necessary. The training continued after commissioning. The submarine conducted exercises, practiced approaches, practiced attacks, practiced evasion. The exercises were evaluated. The performance was critiqued. The crew improved, became more proficient, became more coordinated, became better team. The training was intensive, was designed to prepare for war that was coming, that everyone knew was coming. The only question was when. The crew trained knowing they would soon use these skills in actual combat, knowing their lives would depend on proficiency, knowing mistakes would be fatal. I-168 completed shakedown and training in November, was declared ready for operations, was assigned to patrol duties, initially defensive patrols near Japan, then longer patrols. The crew settled into operational routine, departed port, patrolled assigned area, returned to port. The cycle repeated. The crew became veterans, became experienced, became efficient. The submarine became their home, became familiar, became the world they knew. The steel tube that protected them from ocean, that kept them alive, that contained their lives. The submarine that was new in July was veteran by December. The crew that was assembled for commissioning was functioning unit, was ready, was professional, was prepared for what would come, or as prepared as possible. Some things couldn't be prepared for, could only be experienced, endured, survived, or not. The submarine was ready. The crew was ready. The war was beginning. I-168 would go to war, would conduct combat patrols, would attack enemies, would return sometimes, would not return eventually, would become one of the 80%. But that was future. In December 1941, I-168 was new submarine, was ready submarine, was beginning its service, beginning its story, beginning its descent into the war that would destroy it, that would kill its crew, that would make it tomb beneath Pacific. But not yet. Not yet. The submarine was commissioned. The crew was ready. The war was beginning. The story was just starting. The interior of I-168 was approximately 97 meters long and 8 meters wide at maximum, but the habitable space was far less. Much of the length was taken by machinery, by engines, by batteries, by fuel tanks, by ballast tanks, by torpedo storage. The space where crew lived and worked was fragmented, was divided by equipment, was interrupted by machinery. The actual living space per man was approximately 1 cubic meter, 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. This wasn't continuous space, wasn't private space, was the bunk, was the share of common areas, was all there was. The air inside was the envelope that kept the crew alive, was maintained by machinery. The submarine had to surface regularly to run diesel engines. The engines required air, expelled exhaust. While surfaced, the engines ventilated the interior, brought fresh air in, expelled stale air out. The air was refreshed, but submarines couldn't remain surfaced in combat areas. Had to submerge, had to operate on batteries. While submerged, the air was not refreshed, was recycled, was scrubbed of carbon dioxide by chemical scrubbers, but was not fresh, was not renewed. The oxygen content decreased gradually. The carbon dioxide increased despite scrubbing. The air became stale, became harder to breathe, became oppressive. The crew could feel the air degrading. After hours submerged, the air felt thick, felt heavy. Breathing required effort. The crew became lethargic, became tired. The symptoms were hypoxia, were carbon dioxide poisoning, were effects of bad air. The crew functioned in this air, worked in this air. The efficiency decreased as air quality decreased. The reaction time slowed. The thinking became clouded. The crew pushed through, had no choice, had to maintain operations, had to remain submerged until safe to surface. Sometimes was many hours. Sometimes was days if being hunted. The air that degraded. That became toxic slowly. That made everything harder. Was envelope that kept them alive but barely. The heat in Pacific waters was oppressive. The submarine operated in tropical and subtropical zones. The ocean temperature was warm. The interior temperature was warmer. The machinery generated heat. The engines, when running, generated enormous heat. The electric motors generated heat. The batteries generated heat. The crew generated heat. 75 bodies in enclosed space. The heat accumulated, had nowhere to go. The ventilation was minimal. The air circulation was poor. The temperature inside routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit, sometimes exceeded 45 degrees, 113 Fahrenheit. The heat was unbearable, was inescapable. The crew adapted by wearing minimal clothing, often just shorts, sometimes nothing if not on duty requiring uniform. The crew sweated constantly. The sweat had nowhere to evaporate. The humidity was near 100%. The moisture hung in air, condensed on metal surfaces, dripped from overhead. Everything was damp. The bunks were damp. The clothing was damp. The skin was always wet. The combination of heat and humidity was exhausting, was debilitating. Sleep was difficult, was broken, was insufficient. The crew endured, adapted partially, Never became comfortable, just became accustomed to discomfort, accepted it as normal, as the condition of submarine service. The smell inside was overwhelming to newcomers, was combination of odors, diesel fuel from the engines, oil from machinery, cooking smells from galley, human sweat from 75 men who couldn't bathe, sewage from the heads, the toilets, the bilge water that accumulated, the mildew that grew in damp spaces, all combined into smell that permeated everything, that saturated the air, that clung to skin and clothing. The crew became accustomed, stopped noticing after days. But the smell was evidence of conditions, was marker of the environment, was indication of the closed system, the air that couldn't be fully refreshed, the moisture that couldn't escape, the submarine that was sealed, that was self-contained, that was isolated from everything outside. The food deteriorated rapidly in heat and humidity. Fresh food loaded before patrol lasted days, then was gone. The vegetables rotted, the fruit spoiled, the meat went bad. What remained was canned food, was rice, was dried fish. The diet became monotonous quickly. Rice and canned fish, rice and canned vegetables, rice and little else. The rice itself became infested often. Weevils, other insects. The crew ate it anyway, picked out the insects when possible, ate them when not. The protein was needed, the calories were needed. The crew ate what was available, complained, endured, lost weight, lost strength. The nutrition was inadequate, the vitamins were insufficient. The crew developed deficiencies. Scurvy was common on extended patrols. The gums bled, the teeth loosened, the wounds didn't heal. The crew weakened, became more susceptible to disease, became less effective, became worn down by inadequate nutrition as much as by stress. The sanitation was minimal. The toilets were few, were shared by entire crew, were difficult to use when submerged, required careful procedure, required equalizing pressure, required multiple valves operated in sequence. Mistakes could be catastrophic, could flood compartment. The crew learned the procedure, used the heads carefully, but the heads were always foul, were cleaned but never clean. The smell was constant. The crew minimized use when possible, suffered when not possible. The inability to bathe compounded the hygiene problems. The crew couldn't shower, couldn't wash properly, used minimal water for washing face and hands. The full body washing waited for return to port. The crew went weeks without bathing, months on extended patrols. The body odor accumulated, became overwhelming, became normal. The crew lived in their own filth, had no choice, had no alternative, accepted it, endured it, added it to the list of discomforts that defined submarine service. The psychological stress was constant. The crew lived with awareness that thin steel hull was all that separated them from ocean. That breach of hull meant flooding, meant sinking, meant death. The awareness was always present, was background to everything. The crew could be killed instantly by depth charge, by bomb, by torpedo from another submarine, by collision, by any number of ways. The death could come without warning, could come while sleeping, could come while eating, could come doing routine tasks. The randomness was part of stress, the inability to control fate, the dependence on luck, on timing, on factors beyond control. The crew dealt with stress differently. Some became fatalistic, accepted death as probable, focused on the present, on daily tasks. Others became anxious, became tense, became worn down by constant awareness. Others maintained denial, convinced themselves death wouldn't come, wouldn't happen to them, would happen to others but not them. The denial was adaptation, was psychological protection, worked until it didn't, until death came anyway. The relationships between crew members were complex, were intense. The proximity created bonds, created tensions, created friendships and rivalries. The crew lived in each other's space constantly, had no privacy, no escape, no distance. Everything was shared: the space, the air, the experience, the danger. The relationships formed under these conditions were different from normal friendships, were forged in intensity, were based on dependence, on trust, on shared suffering. The crew knew each other completely, knew each other's habits, weaknesses, strengths, quirks, knew everything. The knowledge was total, was intimate, was unavoidable. Some men became close friends, brothers, would die for each other, would protect each other, would share last ration with each other. Other men developed tensions, conflicts, irritations that grew from proximity, from inability to escape, from personality conflicts that couldn't be resolved. The captain managed these tensions, separated conflicting personalities when possible, mediated disputes, maintained cohesion. The crew's effectiveness depended on relationships working, on crew functioning together despite tensions, despite conflicts, despite the intensity of living together. The hierarchy was strict, was necessary. The captain commanded, the executive officer enforced. The officers led their sections. The petty officers supervised. The seamen followed orders. The hierarchy maintained order, maintained discipline, maintained function. In cramped quarters with constant danger, the hierarchy prevented chaos, prevented breakdown. The respect for rank was essential, was maintained even in informal moments, even in relaxation. The captain was always captain. The officers were always officers. The distance between ranks was maintained, was necessary for command, for authority, for effectiveness. But the distance was less than on surface ships. The proximity required some informality, some relaxation of strictness. The captain who was too rigid created resentment, created tension. The captain who was too familiar lost authority, lost respect. The balance was delicate, was critical. The successful captains maintained authority while acknowledging shared humanity, maintained distance while showing care for crew. The captains who achieved this balance had effective crews, had cohesive units, had submarines that functioned well. The captains who failed created tensions, created problems, created submarines that were less effective, that had lower morale, that suffered more. The rituals were important, were anchors, were structure in the chaos. The daily rituals of watch changes, of meals, of maintenance. The rituals provided rhythm, provided predictability, provided normalcy in abnormal environment. The crew clung to rituals, found comfort in routine, found stability in predictability. The rituals were small often. The way coffee was prepared, the way watch was relieved, the traditions of the boat, the inside jokes, the shared references, the rituals that were unique to this crew, to this submarine. The rituals created identity, created sense of belonging, created the feeling that this submarine was their submarine, that this crew was their crew, that they belonged here, that this was home, however uncomfortable, however dangerous, however temporary. The rituals made the submarine more than machine, made it vessel with character, with personality, with identity, made it theirs. The superstitions were common, were adaptations, were attempts to exert control over uncontrollable. The crew developed superstitions, believed certain actions brought luck, certain actions brought bad luck. The superstitions varied. Some were common across all submarines. Some were unique to this boat. The crew followed superstitions religiously, performed rituals before departure, avoided certain words, performed certain actions in certain ways. The superstitions were irrational, were known to be irrational, but were followed anyway, were comfort, were attempt to influence fate, to control luck, to improve odds. The superstitions harmed nothing, helped psychologically, provided sense of agency, provided feeling of doing something. The crew that followed superstitions felt more in control, felt they were influencing their survival. Even though rationally they knew superstitions meant nothing, the irrationality didn't matter. The psychological benefit mattered. The comfort mattered. The superstitions remained. The mail from home was precious, was delivered when submarine returned to port, was awaited eagerly. The letters from family, from wives, from parents, from children, were connection to other world, to life outside submarine, to normalcy, to love. The crew read letters repeatedly, memorized them, carried them. The letters were reminder that world existed beyond submarine, that family waited, that life would continue after war, that there was reason to survive, reason to endure, reason to keep going. The crew without mail suffered more, felt more isolated, felt more alone. The connection to home was psychological necessity, was what made endurance possible. The crew with families had something to fight for, something to return to, something to survive for. The crew without families struggled more, had less reason, less motivation, less connection to world beyond submarine. The mail mattered enormously, was more important than food almost, was sustenance for the soul, for the spirit, for the will to continue. The small comforts mattered disproportionately. The things that were trivial in normal life became enormously important. The cigarette, the hot cup of tea, the moment of fresh air on deck, the brief conversation, the joke shared. The small comforts were what made life bearable, were what made endurance possible. The crew clung to small comforts, treasured them, sought them. The small comforts were breaks in the monotony, were moments of pleasure, were reminders that joy existed, that life was more than suffering, more than fear, more than endurance. The small comforts were what the crew lived for between dangers, between crises, between moments of terror. The small comforts made the suffering endurable, made the continuation possible, made survival worth achieving. The knowledge of mortality was ever present. The crew knew submarines were dangerous, knew many submarines were lost, knew crew members were dying, knew they might die. The knowledge couldn't be escaped, couldn't be denied, couldn't be forgotten. The crew lived with death, lived with awareness that death might come today, might come this patrol, might come suddenly, without warning, without possibility of prevention. The crew processed this knowledge differently. Some accepted it, became fatalistic, focused on present, on doing duty, on living day to day. Some denied it, refused to think about it, focused on returning home, on surviving, on living through war. Some became obsessed, became anxious, became unable to function effectively, were transferred off submarines usually, were sent to other duties. The crew that remained were those who could function despite knowledge of mortality, who could work despite fear, who could continue despite awareness that death was probable. The psychological strength required was enormous, was not discussed, was not acknowledged, was just expected, was just necessary. The crew that had this strength continued. The crew that didn't broke, was removed. The selection was harsh, was necessary, was what enabled submarines to operate, enabled crews to function, enabled missions to be completed despite odds, despite danger, despite mortality. The crew bonded through shared suffering, through enduring same conditions, through facing same dangers. The bonds were strong, were necessary. The crew depended on each other for technical proficiency, for maintaining vigilance, for maintaining morale, for maintaining sanity. The submarine could only function if crew functioned together, if each man did his duty, if coordination was maintained, if trust existed. The crew that lived together for months, that suffered together, that faced death together, became closer than family, knew each other completely, knew each other's habits, weaknesses, strengths. The knowledge was intimate, was total, was necessary, was what made the crew function as unit, made the submarine effective, made survival possible. The envelope of air contained the crew, connected them, made them one, made them function as organism, made them submarine's crew, made them brothers, made them the men who would live together, fight together, perhaps die together. The envelope of air, the steel tube, the space that was too small, too hot, too uncomfortable, was home, was all they had, was where they lived, was where most would die. The envelope that protected, that confined, that defined existence, that determined fate. The air inside, the crew inside. The submarine that was home and prison and battlefield and tomb. The envelope of air, fragile, precious, temporary, fatal when breached. I-168 departed Kure Naval Base on December 1st, 1941. 6 days before Pearl Harbor. The departure was routine. The families watched from the pier. Waved. The crew was on deck. Waved back. The diesel engines rumbled. The submarine moved slowly from pier. Moved through harbor. Headed toward open ocean. The crew knew this patrol was different. War was imminent. Everyone knew. The tension was higher. The awareness was sharper. This wasn't training. This was beginning of combat operations. The crew was alert, was focused, was preparing mentally for what would come. The transit across Pacific took 2 weeks. The submarine traveled on surface mostly, submerged during day occasionally to practice, to train, to maintain readiness. The days were routine. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off. The routine continued. The submarine moved steadily eastward, toward Hawaii, toward the patrol area assigned. The crew speculated about the mission, about the coming war, about what would happen. The speculation was continuous, was way to process anxiety, to manage stress. The crew talked, shared fears, shared hopes, shared determination. The transit was time to prepare psychologically, to accept what was coming, to steel oneself for combat. The order came by radio on December 7th. War had begun. The attack on Pearl Harbor had occurred. I-168 was now in combat. The mission parameters were transmitted. Patrol area southwest of Hawaii. Watch for American warships departing Pearl Harbor. Attack opportunities. Report sightings. The submarine was now at war. The crew received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that waiting was over. Fear of what combat would mean. Determination to do duty, to accomplish mission, to serve effectively. The speculation ended. The reality began. The submarine was at war. The submarine patrolled for 3 weeks, remained on station, watched for targets. The crew maintained vigilance. The lookouts scanned horizon constantly. The sonar watched. The radio listened. The submarine cruised on surface at night, submerged during day. The pattern repeated, day after day. The patrol was mostly tedious, was watching, was waiting, was maintaining readiness for action that might not come, might come suddenly, might come any moment. The crew remained alert, remained ready, remained tense. The waiting was exhausting, was wearing, was part of submarine warfare, the long periods of monotony, the constant readiness, the sustained tension. The contact came on December 21st. Morning. The lookout spotted smoke on horizon. The captain was notified. The crew went to battle stations. The submarine altered course, headed toward smoke. Approached carefully. The target came into view. Was American destroyer, was moving fast, was zigzagging, was alert. The approach would be difficult. The captain decided to attack. The submarine was positioned. The range was calculated, The torpedo solution was computed. The firing position was achieved. The order was given. 2 torpedoes launched. The crew waited, listened. The torpedoes ran. The wait was excruciating. 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds. Then explosion, impact. The torpedo hit. The destroyer was damaged, began listing. The crew could see through periscope, see the damage, see the American sailors, see the destroyer slowing. The captain ordered dive. The submarine descended, went deep, evaded. The destroyer might have escorts, might have aircraft coming. The submarine fled, descended into darkness, into depth, into safety. The crew was elated. First kill. First success. The attack had worked. The training had paid off. The torpedo had hit. The target was damaged, possibly sinking. The crew celebrated quietly, congratulated each other, felt pride, felt accomplishment, felt validation. The mission was success. The submarine was effective. The crew was capable. The first combat was positive, was encouraging, was exactly what was hoped for. The submarine remained deep for hours, listened for pursuit, heard nothing, eventually surfaced, continued patrol, returned to station, resumed watching. The patrol continued for another week. No more contacts, no more attacks. The patrol concluded. The submarine returned to base. The return to Kur was triumph. The submarine had conducted combat patrol, had engaged enemy, had damaged or sunk destroyer. The crew was congratulated, was praised, was given brief rest. The patrol was analyzed, was evaluated, was considered successful. The captain was commended. The crew was recognized. The first patrol established pattern, established expectations, established that submarine was capable, that crew was effective, that combat success was possible. The first patrol was important psychologically, was validation, was proof, was encouragement. The submarine worked, the torpedoes worked, the crew worked, the doctrine worked. Everything suggested that Japanese submarines would be effective, would contribute to war effort, would accomplish missions. The first patrol was beginning, was foundation, was start of combat record, was success that would be remembered, that would be contrasted with what came later, with what the war would become, with how the successes would diminish, how the losses would mount, how the first patrol would be exception rather than rule. But in December 1941 and January 1942, the first patrol was success, was accomplishment, was beginning of I-168's combat career. The submarine that went to war, that descended into darkness, that returned, that survived, that would go again, would descend again, would fight again. The first patrol was complete, was successful, was survival. The submarine returned. The crew returned. The cycle would repeat, would continue, would consume the submarine eventually, would kill the crew eventually. But not yet. Not on first patrol. On first patrol, the submarine returned. The crew survived. The mission succeeded. The descent into darkness was temporary. The return to light was possible, was achieved, was celebrated. The first patrol, the successful patrol, the patrol that returned, the descent that was reversed, the darkness that was temporary, the submarine that came home. The Japanese submarine doctrine was clear, was specific, was taught at the Naval Academy, was refined through exercises, was implemented through orders. The submarines existed to support the battle fleet, were to function as auxiliaries, were to contribute to decisive surface engagement that would determine the war's outcome. The doctrine was based on strategic concept. The concept assumed that naval war with the United States would follow predictable pattern. The American fleet would advance across Pacific, would seek to relieve the Philippines, would engage Japanese fleet in decisive battle. The outcome of that battle would determine the war. The submarine's role was to ensure Japanese victory in that battle. The method was systematic. The submarines would operate ahead of the Japanese battle fleet, would establish patrol lines, would wait for the American fleet to approach, would detect the American advance, would report enemy positions, would conduct attacks on American capital ships, would reduce American strength before the main engagement. The attacks would target carriers, would target battleships, would target cruisers. The goal was to sink or damage major warships, to reduce American numerical advantage, to weaken the American fleet before it engaged the Japanese battle fleet. Then the Japanese battleships would engage the weakened American force, would defeat it, would win the decisive battle, would win the war. The doctrine determined everything, determined patrol areas, determined target priorities, determined tactics. The submarines were positioned where American fleet was expected to appear. The submarines waited, watched. When American warships were detected, the submarines attacked. The target selection was not discretion of captain, was determined by doctrine. Capital ships were priority. Carriers were highest priority. Battleships were second priority. Cruisers were third. Destroyers were acceptable targets if no better targets available. Merchant ships were lowest priority, were incidental targets, were not worth expending torpedoes on when warships might appear. The doctrine was explicit. The orders were clear. Attack warships, ignore merchants, support the fleet. The flaw was fundamental. The doctrine assumed wrong war, assumed war would be decided by surface engagement. But the war would not be decided that way, would be decided by attrition, by logistics, by ability to project power across Pacific. The American ability to project power depended on supply lines, depended on merchant shipping, depended on oil tankers, cargo ships, transports. The merchant fleet was vulnerable, was essential, was the target that could have been decisively affected by submarine campaign. But the doctrine ignored merchant shipping, treated it as secondary, as incidental, as not worth the effort. The comparison to German U-boat campaign was instructive. The German submarines targeted merchant shipping primarily, attacked convoys, sank cargo, ships, oil tankers, transports. The goal was to strangle Britain's supply lines, to prevent resupply, to starve Britain into submission. The strategy nearly worked. The Battle of the Atlantic was close, was won by allies, but only barely. Only through massive commitment of resources to anti-submarine warfare. Only through technological improvements. Only through enormous effort. The German submarines came close to winning. Through attacking merchants, through targeting logistics, through attempting to strangle supply. The Japanese submarines could have done the same. The American supply lines were vulnerable. The distances across Pacific were vast. The merchant ships were numerous, were slow, were poorly defended initially. The opportunities were enormous. The Japanese submarine force was larger than the German force initially, was more capable in some ways, had greater range, could operate further from home, could have devastated American logistics, could have sunk hundreds of merchant ships, could have delayed American operations, could have made island campaigns more difficult, could have affected the war strategically. The potential was real, was enormous, was never realized. Because the doctrine said attack warships, the doctrine was followed. The opportunities were missed. The specific numbers show the failure. Japanese submarines sank approximately 180 merchant ships during the entire war. German U-boats sank over 2,700. The comparison is stark. The Japanese force was comparable in size, operated for similar duration, but accomplished fraction of what Germans accomplished. The reason was doctrine, was target selection, was strategic concept that was wrong. That was never corrected. That persisted throughout war. That wasted the submarine force. That killed submarines and submariners for minimal strategic gain. The submariners followed doctrine, had no choice, had orders. The orders specified patrol areas, specified target priorities. The submarines went where ordered, attacked what was prioritized, ignored what was deprioritized. The submarine captain who encountered American merchant convoy had orders, had doctrine. The orders said warships were priority. The doctrine said fleet support was mission. The captain let the merchants pass, waited for warships, attacked warships if encountered, or didn't encounter them and returned having accomplished nothing, having sunk nothing, having contributed nothing strategically. The captain followed orders, followed doctrine, did his duty. The failure was not individual, was institutional, was strategic, was doctrinal. I-168 operated under this doctrine. Captain Tanabe followed his orders, patrolled assigned areas, attacked warships when encountered, ignored or gave low priority to merchants. The submarine's second patrol in February 1942 encountered American convoy, 10 merchant ships with 2 destroyer escorts. The convoy was moving supplies to Australia, was vulnerable, was poorly defended. 2 destroyers couldn't adequately protect 10 merchants. The submarine could have attacked, could have sunk multiple merchants, could have disrupted supply line. Captain Tanabe observed the convoy, reported it, did not attack. The orders were to watch for carriers. The doctrine was to attack capital ships. The merchants were not priority. The submarine let them pass. Continued patrol. Looked for warships. Found none. Returned to base. The patrol accomplished nothing. The opportunity was missed. The doctrine was followed. The pattern repeated throughout the force. Throughout the war. The submarines encountered merchants. Let them pass. Waited for warships. Sometimes found warships. Usually didn't. The merchant ships reached their destinations. Delivered supplies. Delivered fuel. Delivered ammunition. Delivered everything the American forces needed. The supply lines remained open. Remained functional. Were barely affected by Japanese submarines. The strategic impact was minimal. The resources invested in submarine force were wasted. The submarines were wasted. The submariners were wasted. All because the doctrine was wrong, was never corrected, was followed faithfully, was obeyed completely, was maintained throughout war. The doctrine that bound them, the doctrine that limited them, the doctrine that wasted them, the doctrine that killed them, not killed directly, killed through misuse, through wasted opportunity, through accomplishing nothing while dying anyway. The submarines that attacked wrong targets, that followed wrong strategy, that obeyed wrong doctrine, died following orders, died accomplishing little, died for strategy that was flawed. The doctrine that bound them was doctrine that killed them, not through direct action, through strategic failure, through wasted potential, through missions that accomplished nothing, through deaths that contributed nothing, through sacrifice that was wasted. The doctrine was clear, was specific, was wrong, was never corrected. Bound the submarines, bound the submariners, bound them to failure, bound them to death, bound them to waste. The doctrine that determined everything, that controlled everything, that limited everything, that killed through limiting, through controlling, through determining that submarines would be misused, would be wasted, would die for nothing. The doctrine that bound them, that killed them, that wasted them, the strategic failure that was doctrinal, that was institutional, that was never corrected, that persisted to the end, that killed submarines and submariners throughout the war. The doctrine that bound them to failure, to death, to waste. The doctrine that was followed, that was obeyed, that killed 10,000 men for minimal strategic gain. The doctrine that bound them. The submarine's greatest vulnerability was surfacing. The submarine had to surface regularly. The diesel engines required air. The batteries required recharging. The crew required ventilation. The submarine could remain submerged for hours, could remain submerged for a day or two if absolutely necessary. but eventually had to surface. Had to run engines, had to recharge, had to ventilate. The surfacing was necessary, was unavoidable, was vulnerability. Initially, the vulnerability was manageable. The submarine surfaced at night. The darkness provided concealment. The submarine was low profile, was difficult to see visually. The lookouts watched for threats, watched horizon, could see approaching ships, could dive before detected. The procedure worked. The submarine surfaced, recharged, submerged before dawn. The routine was safe, was effective, was how submarines operated. The night provided protection, the darkness concealed. The vulnerability was limited. The technology changed this. The Allies developed radar, could detect surfaced submarines electronically, could detect them from distance, could detect them at night. The darkness no longer concealed. The radar saw through darkness, saw the submarine's profile, detected the metal, detected the shape, could detect from 20 miles, from 30 miles. The submarine surfacing at night was no longer invisible, was detectable, was vulnerable. The radar changed everything. The Japanese submarines didn't know initially, didn't know radar existed, didn't know they were being detected. Surfaced, as always, at night, thinking they were concealed, were invisible, were safe. But radar was tracking them, aircraft were being vectored to them, surface ships were being directed to them. The submarines surfaced, thinking they were hidden, were actually being watched, were being hunted, were being approached by enemies they couldn't see, couldn't detect, couldn't know about. The technological advantage was invisible, was silent, was deadly. The radar warning receiver would have helped, would have detected radar signals, would have alerted submarine that it was being tracked, would have enabled evasive action, would have enabled diving before attack. The American submarines had radar warning receivers by 1943, could detect when radar was painting them, could dive, could evade, could survive. The Japanese submarines had no such equipment initially, had no way to detect radar, were blind to the threat, were vulnerable without knowing. The technological gap was decisive, was lethal. I-168 experienced this in May 1942. During patrol near Midway, the submarine surfaced at night, began recharging batteries. The night was dark. The visibility was good. The lookouts saw nothing. The submarine seemed safe, seemed concealed, but American aircraft had detected the submarine on radar, was approaching, was vectored directly to submarine's position. The aircraft arrived without warning. Was overhead before lookouts saw it. The captain ordered crash dive. The crew responded instantly. The vents opened. The ballast tanks flooded. The submarine began descending, but too slowly, too late. The aircraft attacked, dropped depth charges. The charges fell around submarine, exploded at shallow depth. The submarine was 10 meters down, 15 meters. The explosions were close, were too close. The pressure waves hit the hull. The submarine shook violently. Equipment broke loose. Men were thrown. The lights failed. The emergency lights came on. The captain assessed damage. Hull was intact. Systems were damaged but functional. The submarine continued diving, went deeper, evaded, escaped, was lucky, was damaged but survived. The crew understood something had changed. The aircraft had appeared without warning, had known exactly where submarine was, had attacked immediately. The usual warning signs were absent. The aircraft engine sound that usually preceded appearance. The visual detection that gave seconds to dive. None of that happened. The aircraft was just there, was attacking. The crew didn't understand how, didn't understand radar, didn't know technology existed. Just knew that surfacing had become more dangerous, that the night no longer concealed, that something had changed, that vulnerability had increased. The crew became more cautious, surfaced more carefully, dove faster when threats appeared. but couldn't change fundamental requirement. Still had to surface, still had to recharge, still had to ventilate, still had to accept the risk that had increased, that had become more lethal, that they didn't fully understand. The sonar was the other technology. The underwater detection. The Allied sonar improved throughout the war, became more sensitive, could detect submarines at greater range, could track them more accurately, could maintain contact more effectively. The early sonar was limited, could detect to perhaps 1,000 meters. The improved sonar could detect to 3,000 meters, 5,000 meters. The range increased, the accuracy increased, the reliability increased. The submarines operating underwater were increasingly detectable, were increasingly vulnerable to tracking, to pursuit, to attack. The submarine could hear the sonar. The active sonar sent pulses, sent pings. The sound traveled through water, hit the submarine, echoed back. The submarine's hydrophone operators heard the pings, heard them coming, heard them hitting, knew they were being tracked. The sound was distinctive, was metallic, was rhythmic. Ping, pause, ping, pause. The interval indicated the range. The pings coming faster meant the hunter was approaching, closing. The submarine could evade, could change course, could change depth, could try to break contact, could go silent, could turn off all machinery, could drift, could try to hide. Sometimes worked, often didn't. The improved sonar maintained contact, tracked the submarine, guided the attack. The depth charges followed, found the submarine, attacked. The sonar made underwater much more dangerous, made the depths no longer safe, made the submarine vulnerable everywhere, surface or submerged, day or night. The technology saw, heard, tracked, found, killed. The Japanese technology didn't improve comparably. The Japanese submarines didn't get better radar, didn't get radar warning receivers until very late, didn't get improved sonar. The technology stagnated, remained essentially unchanged from 1941 to 1945. The Allied technology improved continuously. Every year the sensors were better. The detection was better. The tracking was better. Every year the Japanese submarines were more vulnerable, more detectable, more likely to be found, more likely to be killed. The gap widened, became chasm, became decisive, became determinant of who lived and who died. The crew of I-168 understood they were being hunted more effectively, understood that surfacing was more dangerous, understood that being submerged didn't guarantee safety, understood that the enemy could find them, could track them, could attack them, didn't understand the technology fully, didn't understand radar, didn't understand improved sonar, just understood that the enemy was better at finding submarines, that every patrol was more dangerous, that survival was becoming less probable, that the technology had turned against them, that they were operating at disadvantage, that the disadvantage was growing, that the hunting was becoming more effective, that the submarines were dying faster, that the deaths were accelerating, that something fundamental had changed, that the war was being lost underwater, that the technology was defeating them, that there was no counter, no response, no adaptation, just increasing vulnerability, increasing losses, increasing probability of death. The technology had turned against them, the radar that saw through darkness, the sonar that heard through water, the weapons that followed, that found, that killed. The technology that the Japanese submarines didn't have, didn't counter, didn't match. The gap that widened, that became decisive, that killed. The hunt that became more effective, that found submarines more easily, that killed them more frequently. The technology that turned against them, that made every patrol more dangerous, that made survival less likely, that made death more probable, that contributed to the 80%, that helped destroy the force, that killed the submarines, killed the submariners. the technology that turned against them, the advantage they couldn't see, couldn't counter, could only die to, the technology that hunted them, that found them, that killed them, the hunt that became systematic, that became efficient, that became deadly, the technology that turned against them. I-168 departed for its third combat patrol in April 1942, 4 months after the first patrol. The submarine was no longer new. The paint was weathered. The equipment showed wear. The engines had accumulated hours. The systems had been repaired multiple times. The submarine showed its service, showed its use, showed its age. The crew was different too. 3 men had been replaced. 1 died from illness in port. 2 were transferred. The replacements were less experienced, were recent graduates of submarine school, were adequate but not veterans. The crew was slightly diminished, slightly less cohesive, slightly less experienced. The changes were minor, were normal, were part of operational cycle, but represented beginning of decline, beginning of degradation, beginning of the wearing down that would eventually destroy the submarine. The departure was routine. The families watched, waved. The crew waved back. The routine was familiar, had been done before, would be done again. The submarine left port, headed to patrol area. The assignment was near Midway, was to watch for American fleet movements, was to report, was to attack if opportunities arose. The transit took 2 weeks, was uneventful. The submarine arrived on station, began patrol. The routine was established. Surface at night, submerge at dawn, patrol during day, surface at dusk. The cycle repeated, day after day, week after week. The patrol lasted 6 weeks, was longer than first patrol. The crew felt the duration, felt the accumulated stress, felt the wearing. The food was worse. The fresh food was gone in first week. The rice was infested more heavily. The canned food was monotonous. The crew lost weight, lost strength. The heat was oppressive. The temperature never dropped below 40 degrees. The crew suffered, sweated constantly, slept poorly, felt exhausted constantly. The conditions wore them down, made everything harder, made effectiveness decline. The crew functioned, but at reduced capacity, at reduced alertness, at reduced efficiency. The contacts were more frequent this patrol. The submarine encountered aircraft 3 times. Each time had to crash dive, had to evade. One time the depth charges came, were not close, were not dangerous, but were frightening. The crew heard them falling, heard the explosions, felt the submarine shake, felt the fear, felt the awareness that death was nearby, was meters away, was luck that they survived. Not skill, not evasion, just luck. Just that the charges weren't closer, weren't directly overhead. The incident affected morale, affected confidence, affected the crew's understanding of vulnerability, of luck, of mortality. The depth charges that weren't close enough this time might be close enough next time, might kill next time. The awareness settled, stayed, became part of the background, part of the constant stress, part of the environment. The submarine encountered surface ships twice, both times at long range, too far to attack. The captain considered closing, considered approaching, decided against it. The risk was too high. The escorts were numerous. The detection was probable. The attack would likely fail. The submarine would likely be killed. The captain chose survival over mission, chose caution over aggression. The choice was reasonable, was prudent, but represented change. On first patrol, the captain had been more aggressive, had taken risks, had attacked. Now was more cautious, more aware of danger, more focused on survival. The change was subtle, was understandable, was beginning of the defensive mindset that would eventually dominate, would eventually paralyze, would eventually contribute to ineffectiveness. The submarine encountered merchant convoy. 8 ships with destroyer escort. Moving slowly. Was vulnerable. Was opportunity. The captain observed through periscope. Calculated the approach. Considered the attack. Decided against it. The orders were to watch for warships. The convoy had no warships. Just destroyer escort. Just merchants. The orders were clear. Warships were priority. The captain followed orders. Let the convoy pass. The crew was disappointed. Wanted to attack. Wanted to accomplish something. Wanted success. The decision to not attack was correct according to doctrine, according to orders, but was missed opportunity, was strategic error, was following orders that were wrong. The submarine accomplished nothing, sank nothing. The patrol was failure in terms of results, was success in terms of survival. The submarine returned. The crew survived, but accomplished nothing. The return to base was different from first patrol. There was no celebration, no congratulations. The submarine had conducted patrol, had survived, but had sunk nothing, had accomplished nothing. The patrol was evaluated as unsuccessful. The captain was questioned about the missed convoy, about the decision not to attack, defended the decision, cited orders, cited doctrine, was supported officially, was criticized informally. The contradiction was evident. The orders said one thing, the criticism said another. The captain understood that orders were wrong, understood that doctrine was wrong, but couldn't say so, couldn't disobey, could only follow orders, follow doctrine, accept criticism, accept that the war was being fought wrong, that the submarines were being misused, that nothing could be done. The captain's frustration was shared by other captains, by other crews, by entire force. The understanding that the strategy was wrong, that the submarines were being wasted, that nothing was changing, that nothing would change, that they would continue operating under wrong doctrine, would continue accomplishing little, would continue dying anyway. The crew received brief rest, 1 week, then prepared for next patrol. The routine continued. The wear continued. The decline continued. The submarine was older, was more worn, was less capable. The crew was more experienced in some ways, was more worn down in others, was less fresh, less energetic, less optimistic. The second patrol had been survived, had been endured, had accomplished nothing. The third patrol would follow, then the fourth, then the fifth. Each patrol wearing down the submarine slightly more, wearing down the crew slightly more. Each patrol surviving was success. Each patrol accomplishing nothing was failure. The contradiction continued. The cycle continued. The submarine continued operating, continued patrolling, continued surviving, continued accomplishing little. The veteran submarine, the worn submarine, the submarine that was aging, that was degrading. That was being consumed. Slowly, patrol by patrol, mission by mission. The decline that was progressive, that was inevitable, that was leading to eventual loss, to eventual death, to eventual sinking, but not yet. Not on second patrol. The submarine returned. The crew survived. The veteran submarine continued. The decline continued. The war continued. The dying continued. Elsewhere, to other submarines, to other crews, but not yet to I-168. Not yet. The veteran submarine, the surviving submarine, the submarine that continued, that endured, that patrolled again, that would eventually not return. But not yet. Not on second patrol. Not yet. The depth charge was most common cause of death. The weapon was simple. Was cylinder filled with explosives, was dropped from surface ship, sank through water, detonated at preset depth. The fuse was set for depth where submarine was estimated to be. The charge sank, reached the set depth, exploded. The explosion created pressure wave, traveled through water. Water transmitted pressure better than air. The pressure wave was more destructive underwater. Traveled further, hit harder. The submarine caught in pressure wave experienced massive force. The force crushed, bent metal, ruptured hull, broke welds, destroyed equipment, killed crew. The attack pattern used multiple charges. 6 charges, 12 charges, 24 charges, dropped in pattern, in grid. The charges fell in sequence, exploded at intervals, created multiple pressure waves, created overlapping destruction. The submarine couldn't evade all charges, couldn't escape the pattern. If inside the pattern, survival was unlikely. The charges didn't need direct hit, didn't need to land on submarine, just needed to explode close. The pressure wave did the killing, the wave that traveled through water, that found the submarine, that crushed it. The experience from inside was terror. The crew heard the charges falling, heard them hitting water, heard the distinct splash. Each splash had specific sound, was recognizable. The experienced crew could estimate distance from sound, could judge how close, could understand danger level. The crew counted them, 1, 2, 3. Knew each splash meant charge was falling, was sinking toward them. The counting was compulsive, was automatic, was way to process fear, to focus mind, to have something to do while waiting. The wait between splash and explosion was seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, depending on depth. The wait was eternal, was agony, was knowing death might be coming, might be a next explosion, might be seconds away. The submarine went silent during attack. All machinery stopped, all crew silent. The silence was absolute, was eerie, was unnatural after constant machinery noise. In silence, the crew heard everything, heard the splashes, heard the charges sinking, heard the propellers of attacking ship overhead, heard the sonar pings, heard everything that meant death might be coming. The crew stood at stations, sat at stations, held on to equipment, held on to each other sometimes, just waited, just listened, just endured. The waiting that was passive, that was helpless, that was awareness that survival was luck. Not skill, not action, just luck, just chance, just whether the charges landed close enough or not. The explosion came suddenly, came as sound first, as massive crack, as report that was deafening. The sound traveled through water, through hull, into submarine, into ears, into bones. The sound was physical, was felt as much as heard. Then came the pressure, came as shock wave, as force, as blow against submarine. The submarine jumped, lifted, dropped, shook violently. The hull flexed, bent, groaned. The metal screamed. Made sounds metal shouldn't make, made sounds that were terrifying, that sounded like tearing, like failing, like breaking. The crew held on, held tight, held whatever they could, held themselves, waited for hull to hold or to fail. The equipment broke loose if not secured, flew across compartments, became projectiles, injured crew, killed sometimes. The lights failed, went dark. The emergency lights came on, red, dim, created shadows, created nightmare lighting. The crew in red light, in shadows, in shaking submarine, in sound of tortured metal, in fear absolute. The damage accumulated with each explosion. The first charge might crack weld, the second might widen crack, the third might rupture it, or might not, might just damage more welds, might crack more metal. The damage was cumulative, was progressive. Each charge did harm even if didn't rupture hull. Weakened structure, damaged systems, created leaks, small leaks, manageable leaks, until they weren't manageable, until too many accumulated, until the submarine was damaged too severely, was taking on water too fast, was sinking despite crew's efforts. The accumulation that was death sentence, that was slower than rupture, but just as final. The pattern continued. Explosion after explosion, shake after shake. The submarine enduring or not enduring, the crew suffering, fearing, praying, waiting. The attack might last minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, might feel like hours, like eternity. The crew lost track of time, lost count of explosions, just endured, just survived each moment, each explosion, each shake. The crew that emerged from attack was different, was traumatized, was shaken, was marked by experience. Even if submarine survived undamaged, even if crew was physically unharmed, was psychologically harmed, was changed by experience. The crew that was depth-charged understood mortality differently, understood vulnerability, understood that survival was chance, that death had been close, that next time might be closer, might be close enough. The knowledge stayed, affected everything, affected confidence, affected effectiveness, affected willingness to take risks. The crew after depth charge attack was more cautious, was more afraid, was less effective sometimes, was what depth charges did. Killed submarines, killed crews, traumatized survivors. The rupture was catastrophic when it came. The pressure wave found weakness, found crack, found compromised weld, opened it, tore it, created breach. The ocean entered under pressure, entered violently. The water at depth was under enormous pressure. 300 meters depth meant 30 atmospheres, 30 times normal pressure. The water entering through breach was violent, was jet, was blast, was unstoppable force. The water filled compartment in seconds. The crew in that compartment had no chance, were caught by water, were smashed by force, were drowned immediately. The water was cold, was powerful, was death. The crew couldn't escape, couldn't reach hatches, couldn't open hatches against pressure, couldn't do anything, could only die, drowned in seconds, in their compartment, at their stations, doing their duties. The drowning that was instant, that was violent, that was inescapable. The submarine with breached compartment might survive if watertight doors held, if adjacent compartments remained sealed. The submarine could lose one compartment, could lose two sometimes, if crew sealed doors in time, if watertight integrity held. But the submarine was damaged, was compromised, was taking on water, was heavier, was harder to control. Might sink anyway, might sink slowly, or might stabilize, might surface if enough buoyancy remained, might escape, might survive. The crew in sealed compartments survived if submarine surfaced, died if submarine sank. The survival depended on damage, on how many compartments flooded, on whether submarine could maintain positive buoyancy, on whether it could surface, on luck, on chance, on factors beyond crew's control. The crew sealed compartments, waited, hoped, prayed, did everything possible. Then waited to see if would live or die. The waiting that determined fate, that decided survival, that ended in life or death. The aircraft attack was different, was sudden. The submarine surfacing thought it was safe, thought night concealed it, thought it was invisible, was wrong. The radar had detected it. The aircraft was approaching, was vectored to exact position. The crew didn't know, didn't hear aircraft approaching, didn't see it coming. The first indication was often the aircraft already overhead, already attacking, already dropping bombs. The time to react was seconds. The captain ordered crash dive. The crew responded instantly, was trained reaction, was practiced maneuver. The vents opened, the ballast tanks flooded. The submarine began descending, but slowly, too slowly. The descent took time, took 30 seconds to get to 10 meters, took minute to get to 20 meters. The submarine diving was vulnerable, was partially submerged, couldn't maneuver well, couldn't escape, could only continue diving, continue descending, hope to get deep enough before bombs hit. The bombs fell while submarine was diving, fell from low altitude, the aircraft attacking at a mast height almost, dropping bombs directly onto submarine. The bombs hit water, sank quickly, were fused for shallow depth, exploded at 5 meters, 10 meters. The submarine at this depth was hit by full force. The explosion was against hull, was direct, was devastating. The hull ruptured, flooded. The submarine sank immediately, dropped to bottom like stone. The crew had seconds, had no time to react, no time to respond, no time to do anything, just explosion, flooding, death. The aircraft attack killed quickly, killed efficiently, killed before submarine could defend, before could escape, before could respond. The attack that was over in seconds, the submarine that was alive then dead, the crew that was functioning then gone. The aircraft attack that was sudden death. That was no warning, that was no chance, that was death from above. Death from sky, death from direction that couldn't be defended against, couldn't be escaped from, could only be avoided by not surfacing, by staying submerged. But that was impossible. The submarine had to surface eventually, had to recharge, had to ventilate, had to accept risk, had to face danger, had to be vulnerable. The aircraft that hunted surfaced submarines, that found them with radar, that killed them with bombs. The aircraft that were everywhere, that were always dangerous, that were reason submarines couldn't surface safely, that were killers from above. The mine was random death. The mine placed months before, placed in shipping lane, in approach to port, in channel, in area where submarines operated. The mine waited, floated at depth, anchored to bottom, waiting for contact, for victim. The submarine transited area, moved through water, didn't know mine was there, had no way to detect it, no way to avoid it, just moving normally, moving routinely. The submarine struck mine. The contact detonated fuse. The explosion was immediate, was massive, was against hull. The mine explosive was hundreds of kilograms. The explosion was designed to sink ships, was more than sufficient to destroy submarine. The hull ruptured, breached catastrophically. The submarine flooded instantly, through enormous breach, through hole meters wide. The water entered violently, filled submarine in seconds. The crew had no warning, no indication, just explosion, just flooding, just death. The mine that killed everyone, that sank submarine immediately, that left no survivors, no witnesses, no story, just submarine that departed. That was transiting, that struck mine, that died, that disappeared. The mine that was chance, that was random, that was bad luck, that was being in wrong place, wrong moment, wrong meter of ocean. The mine that killed completely, that killed instantly, that killed without warning, without defense, without possibility of survival. The random death, the chance death, the luck death, the mine that waited. That killed, that left nothing. The submarine that was damaged but didn't sink immediately faced slow death. The submarine unable to surface, unable to move, unable to function. Sitting on bottom, the damage was too severe to repair. The flooding was controlled but couldn't be stopped. The submarine was dying slowly. The crew was trapped, was alive, was aware, was knowing death was coming. The air was what killed slowly. The envelope of air that sustained life, that kept crew alive, that was limited, that was degrading. The oxygen was depleting, was being consumed by breathing, by 70 men breathing, using oxygen, producing carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide scrubbers removed some, but not enough. Not at this rate. Not with this many men. The oxygen decreased. The carbon dioxide increased. The air became bad, became toxic, became unbreathable. The symptoms progressed predictably. The headaches first. The crew felt headaches, felt dizzy. The mild symptoms of hypoxia, of carbon dioxide poisoning. The symptoms worsened. The breathing became labored, became difficult, required effort. The crew became lethargic, became weak, became confused. The thinking became clouded. The judgment became impaired. The crew understood what was happening, understood they were suffocating, understood death was approaching, understood they couldn't prevent it, couldn't escape it, couldn't survive it, could only wait for air to run out, wait for death. The waiting was agony, was torture, was knowing death was coming, was feeling it approach, was experiencing the progressive failure of body, of mind, of life. The crew tried to reduce oxygen consumption, tried to slow breathing, tried to remain still, tried to make air last longer, tried to delay inevitable, tried to survive longer, tried to hope for rescue that wouldn't come, that couldn't come, that was impossible. The end came slowly. The oxygen depleted. The carbon dioxide accumulated. The crew lost consciousness gradually. One by one, the weakest first, the youngest, the oldest, the sick, then the others. One by one losing consciousness, slipping away, dying quietly, dying in darkness, dying together, dying in submarine that was tomb, that was grave, that was their final resting place, the death that was slow, that was conscious, that was known, that was worst death possible. The crew that drowned died quickly. The crew that was blown up died instantly. The crew that suffocated died slowly, died knowing, died aware, died unable to prevent, died trapped, died helpless, died in darkness, died together. The submarine that became tomb while crew still lived, that became grave before crew died, that held them, kept them, killed them. The slow death, the knowing death, the trapped death, the worst death, the death that some submarines experienced, that some crews endured. That was final agony, final suffering, final cruelty of submarine warfare, the ways submarines died, the ways crew died, the mechanisms, the methods, the variety of deaths, the certainty of death, the many paths to same end, the depth charges, the aircraft, the mines, the torpedoes, the flooding, the suffocation, the crushing, the varieties, the methods, all leading to same place, to death, to grave beneath ocean, to steel tomb, to final resting place, the ways submarines died, the ways submariners died, the deaths that came in many forms, that ended in one result, death beneath waves, entombment in steel, burial in ocean, forever. I-168 departed on its 11th patrol in June 1943. Departed truck, headed to patrol area near Solomon Islands. The transit took 1 week. The submarine arrived on station, sent radio message confirming arrival, began patrol. The message was acknowledged, was recorded, was last contact. The submarine was expected to maintain radio silence except for critical reports. The silence was normal, was expected, was part of operations. The submarine patrolled for 3 weeks. Sent no messages, was expected. The patrol duration was 4 weeks. The submarine was expected to send departure message after completing patrol. Expected to report returning to base. The expected message didn't come. The scheduled departure date passed. No message, no contact. Days passed. A week. The submarine was overdue, was officially reported as delayed. Search was not conducted, was not possible. The area was too large. The resources were too limited. The submarine was assumed to be continuing patrol, would contact when possible, would return when completed. 2 weeks after scheduled return date, I-168 was declared missing. The submarine was presumed lost. The crew was listed as casualties, presumed dead. The families were notified. Your son, or husband, father is missing. Submarine failed to return from patrol. Presumed lost at sea. No further information available. The notification was final, was definitive, was end. The submarine was gone. The crew was dead. The cause was unknown. The location was unknown. Everything was unknown except absence, except that submarine departed That submarine didn't return. That crew was dead. That I-168 was lost. The official record noted the loss. I-168 lost June-July 1943. Cause unknown. Location unknown. No survivors. The record was complete in what mattered. Submarine was gone. Crew was dead, but incomplete in everything else. What happened? Where? When? How? All unknown. The submarine that had been commissioned in July 1941, that had conducted 10 patrols, that had survived 2 years of war, had disappeared, had vanished, had left no trace, no wreckage, no oil slick, no debris, no survivors, no witnesses, nothing but absence, nothing but failure to return, nothing but silence where there should have been radio contact, nothing but empty ocean where there should have been submarine. The disappearance was complete, was total, was absolute. The speculation was possible, was inevitable. The submarine was attacked. Probably. Was sunk. Obviously. The method was unknown. Depth charges. Probably. Or aircraft. Possibly. Or mine. Maybe. Or submarine. Perhaps. The specific cause was unknowable. The result was certain. The submarine was destroyed. The crew was killed. The submarine sank. Rested on ocean floor. Somewhere in Solomon Islands area. Somewhere in the patrol zone. Somewhere beneath the waves. The location was unknown. Was unknowable without search. The search was not conducted. Would not be conducted. The submarine would remain lost. Would remain where it sank. Would remain unknown. Undiscovered. Unmarked. The grave that was unmarked, was unknown, was lost. The crew that was entombed, that was buried, that was forgotten. The disappearance that was final, that was complete, that was permanent. The families had no closure, had notification, had confirmation of death, but had no details, had no story, had no understanding, just absence, just loss. Just grief without resolution, the wife who waited, who hoped, who eventually accepted, but never knew, never understood what happened. When death occurred, how death occurred, where husband died, where submarine sank, where remains rested. The uncertainty was torture, was agony, was question without answer, was loss without closure, the grief that couldn't complete, couldn't resolve, couldn't finish. Because the story had no end. Just absence. Just stopped. Just disappeared. Like the submarine, like the crew, like everything, the disappearance that extended to memory, to story, to understanding, all disappeared, all absent, all lost. I-168 was one of many. The submarines that disappeared, that left and didn't return, that vanished without trace. The number was substantial. Was majority eventually. Most submarines lost after 1943 were disappearances. Were submarines that departed? That were presumed to be operating, that were expected to return, that didn't return, that sent no distress call, that left no evidence, just disappeared. The pattern was consistent, was repeated, was common. The submarine departed. Contact ceased. Submarine didn't return, was declared missing, was presumed lost. Crew was presumed dead. The cycle repeated. Submarine after submarine, crew after crew, disappearance after disappearance. The force diminished through disappearances, through submarines that vanished, through crews that were lost without trace, without story, without explanation. The modern search has found some. The technology can locate wrecks, can survey ocean floor, can identify submarines. Some Japanese submarines have been found, have been located, have been photographed, have been documented. The finding provides some closure, provides confirmation, provides location, provides evidence of what happened. The hull shows damage, shows how submarine died. Depth charge damage, torpedo damage, implosion damage. The wreck tells story, tells what the disappearance hid, reveals what was unknown, but most remain unfound. remain lost, remain beneath ocean, remain unmarked, remain unknown. The submarines that disappeared remain disappeared, the crews remain lost, the stories remain untold, the disappearances remain complete. The disappearance was common fate, was how most submarines died. Not through dramatic battle, not through witnessed destruction, through simple absence, through departure and no return, through silence where there should have been communication, through absence where there should have been presence. The disappearance that was death, that was loss, that was end. The submarines that vanished, the crews that were lost, the deaths that were unwitnessed, unrecorded, unknown. The disappearances that defined the campaign, that showed the reality, that revealed how submarines died. Not dramatically, not heroically, not witnessed, just disappeared, just vanished, just stopped existing, just became absent, just died, silently, invisibly, completely. The disappearances, the vanishings, the absences, the submarines that left, that didn't return, that vanished beneath waves, that remain beneath waves, that are lost still, that are absent still, that disappeared then, remain disappeared now. The submarines, the crews, the stories, all disappeared, all lost, all gone. The disappearances that were majority, that were how most died, how 80% died. Through disappearance, through vanishing, through becoming absent, through ceasing to exist, through dying silently, without witness, without record, without trace. The disappearances. By January 1944, I-168 had been lost for 6 months, but other submarines continued. The force was diminishing, the losses were accelerating, the submarines that remained were older, were worn, were crewed by less experienced men. The veteran submariners were dead mostly, were lost with their submarines. The replacements were younger, were hastily trained, were adequate but not experienced. The quality of crews was declining. The effectiveness was declining. The survival rate was declining. Everything was declining. Everything was getting worse. The submarines that operated in 44 faced worse conditions than those in 41, faced better Allied defenses, faced more hunters, faced better technology, faced higher probability of death. The desperation was evident in mission types. The submarines were no longer being used primarily for combat operations, were being diverted to other purposes, to supply runs, to evacuations, to transport missions. The submarines that should have been attacking were being used as cargo vessels, were delivering supplies to bypassed garrisons, were evacuating personnel from islands that were surrounded, were conducting missions that weren't submarine missions, that were wastes of submarine capability, that exposed submarines to enormous danger for minimal military value. The missions were ordered because other options didn't exist, because the surface navy couldn't reach these locations, because submarines were only vessels that could. The missions were necessary in the sense that soldiers needed supplies, needed evacuation, but were waste of submarines, were waste of crews, were acknowledgement that war was lost, that normal operations were impossible, that desperation was determining strategy. The submarine I-52 departed Kure in March 1944, was supply submarine, was Type C3, was configured for cargo rather than combat. The submarine was approximately 110 meters long, could carry 300 tons of cargo, was loaded with rubber, tin, tungsten, quinine, opium, gold, was carrying materials Japan needed to trade with Germany, was bound for occupied France, for German ports, was part of desperate cooperation between Axis partners, was attempting to maintain connection across Allied-dominated oceans. The mission was ambitious, was dangerous, was unlikely to succeed. The submarine had to transit entire Pacific, cross to Atlantic, navigate through Allied air cover, through Allied naval forces, through waters that were controlled by enemy. The probability of success was low. Everyone knew this. The submarine departed anyway. The transit across Pacific took 2 months. The submarine traveled carefully, submerged during day, surfaced at night, avoided contacts, avoided detection, reached the Indian Ocean, continued west. The submarine refueled from German U-boat near Azores. The rendezvous was successful, was proof that coordination between Germany and Japan still functioned, still was possible despite distance, despite Allied domination of oceans. The submarine continued toward France, toward German-controlled ports, was detected by American aircraft operating from Azores. The aircraft had radar, detected submarine at night, tracked it, vectored surface ships, guided them to submarine's position. The submarine was attacked, was depth-charged, was sunk in June 1944, west of Cape Verde Islands. The entire crew was lost. 106 men. The cargo was lost. 300 tons. The gold was lost. Was fortune in gold. Was never recovered. The mission failed completely. Accomplished nothing. Achieved nothing. The submarine was destroyed. The crew was killed. The cargo was lost. The desperate mission that failed. That cost submarine. That cost crew. That achieved nothing. The supply missions to bypass garrisons were equally futile. The Japanese forces on various Pacific islands were cut off, were surrounded, were without supply, without reinforcement, without hope of relief. The submarines were ordered to supply them, to deliver food, ammunition, medicine, fuel, to keep garrisons functioning, to delay their collapse. The missions were nearly suicidal. The areas around bypassed islands were heavily patrolled, were covered by air power, were controlled by Allies. The submarines attempting to approach were detected easily, were attacked relentlessly. Most failed to deliver supplies. Most were sunk. The few that succeeded delivered minimal supplies, delivered ton or two. Nothing that significantly helped garrison. Nothing that changed outcome. Just delayed inevitable, at cost of submarine, at cost of crew. The missions that achieved nothing, that cost everything. The submarine I-36 departed Surabaya in November 1944, was assigned supply mission to Timor, was ordered to deliver supplies to Japanese garrison on island. The garrison was surrounded by Allied forces, was cut off, was without supply for months, was desperate. The submarine loaded 50 tons of supplies, food, ammunition, medicine, departed for Timor. The journey was dangerous from start. The waters around Indonesia were heavily patrolled, were controlled by Allied forces. The submarine transited carefully, slowly, submerged during day, surfaced briefly at night, made progress, approached Timor, attempted to approach the island at night, was detected by Allied aircraft, was attacked, was sunk. The entire crew was lost. The supplies were lost. The garrison remained unsupplied, remained desperate, would eventually surrender. The mission failed, accomplished nothing. The submarine was destroyed. The crew was killed. For nothing. For mission that was impossible. That never should have been ordered. That killed submarine and crew unnecessarily. The desperation that ordered impossible missions. That wasted submarines. That killed crews. That achieved nothing. The evacuation missions were similarly desperate. The submarines were ordered to evacuate personnel from bypassed islands, to rescue commanders, to extract specialists, to remove personnel who were considered valuable. The missions were difficult, required approaching enemy-controlled islands, required surfacing near shore, required exposing submarine to observation, to attack, to danger. Many submarines were lost attempting evacuations, were sunk while approaching islands, were sunk while personnel were boarding, were sunk while departing. The evacuations that succeeded extracted dozens of personnel, Perhaps hundreds over multiple missions. The evacuations that failed lost entire submarine crews, lost 60 to 100 men. The mathematics were brutal. The missions killed more personnel than they saved. Were net loss, were waste, but were ordered anyway. Because commanders wanted to save themselves, wanted to extract before surrender, wanted to avoid captivity. The submarines were sacrificed for this, were sent on missions that benefited few at cost of many. The submarines that could have been attacking, that could have been contributing to war effort, were being used as lifeboats, were being wasted, were being destroyed for missions that saved dozens, killed hundreds. The desperation that drove these decisions, that ordered these missions, that wasted submarines and crews for minimal gain. The crew quality had declined severely by late 1944. The training time had been reduced from months to weeks. The standards had been lowered. The recruits were younger, were less educated, were less prepared. The experienced instructors were mostly dead, were lost with their submarines. The replacements teaching were barely more experienced than students. The training was inadequate, was rushed, was insufficient. The submariners graduating in 1944 weren't ready, weren't properly trained, weren't capable like veterans had been, but were sent anyway. Were assigned to submarines, were sent on patrols, were expected to function, to survive. Most didn't. Most died quickly, within first patrol, within first month. The inadequate training translated directly to casualties, to deaths, to submarines lost because crews weren't capable, weren't ready, weren't sufficient. The submarines themselves were worn, were old, were maintained poorly. The spare parts were scarce. The maintenance periods were shortened. The submarines were sent on patrol with known problems, with marginal systems, with equipment that was failing. The mechanical reliability was poor. The submarines broke down more frequently. The breakdowns occurred at dangerous times. During patrols, during contacts, during attacks. The submarine that couldn't dive quickly because machinery failed. The submarine that couldn't maneuver because steering failed. The submarine that surfaced involuntarily because systems failed. The breakdowns that made submarines more vulnerable. That made missions more dangerous. That contributed to losses. The worn equipment, the inadequate maintenance, the insufficient spare parts, all contributed to declining effectiveness, to increasing vulnerability, to accelerating losses. The missions in 1945 were final desperation. The submarines that remained were sent on missions that were essentially suicide, were ordered to patrol areas that were completely controlled by allies, were ordered to attack targets that were heavily defended, were ordered to accomplish objectives that were impossible. The crews knew, understood the missions were death sentences, were ordered anyway, went anyway, had duty, had orders, had tradition of obedience, had no choice. The submarines departed knowing they wouldn't return. The crews said final goodbyes, wrote final letters, made final preparations, departed for final patrol. The patrol that would end in death, that everyone knew would end in death. That was sent anyway. The submarine I-56 departed Yokosuka in April 1945, 4 months before war's end. The mission was patrol near Okinawa. The American invasion of Okinawa was underway. The seas around Okinawa were saturated with American ships, were covered by aircraft, were controlled completely. The submarine entering this area had no chance, had no possibility of accomplishing anything, had certainty of being detected, being attacked, being killed. The crew understood. The captain understood. The orders were given, were obeyed. The submarine departed, transited toward Okinawa, was detected within 3 days, was tracked by destroyer escorts, was hunted systematically, was depth-charged repeatedly, was sunk, entire crew lost, 83 men. The submarine accomplished nothing, sank nothing, attacked nothing, just died, just became another loss, another grave beneath ocean. The mission that was pointless, that was waste, that was murder by incompetent orders, that killed crew for nothing. The Kai-10 missions were ultimate desperation. The Kai-10 were manned torpedoes, were suicide weapons, were torpedoes with cockpit, were controlled by pilot who rode the torpedo to target, who died in impact, who were suicide attackers. The submarines were modified to carry Kai-10, were sent on missions to launch Kai-10 against enemy ships. The missions were complex, required approaching enemy formations, launching Kai-10 while submerged. The pilots entered Kai-10 from submarine, sealed hatches, controlled torpedo toward target, detonated on impact, died in explosion. The missions killed Kai-10 pilots always, killed submarine crews often. The submarines launching Kai-10 were vulnerable, were exposed, were often detected and sunk. The missions that killed Kai-10 pilots by design, killed submarine crews by accident. The desperation that created Kai-10, that used them, that wasted submarines deploying them, the final madness, the final waste, the final evidence that war was lost, that strategy had failed, that desperation controlled decisions. The submarine I-47 conducted Kai-10 mission in November 1944. Departed carrying 6 Kai-10, approached Ulithi Atoll, American fleet anchorage, launched Kai-10. 5 Kai-10 launched successfully. Pilots departed submarine, controlled torpedoes toward targets. 1 Kai-10 sank American oiler, Mississinawa, caused significant damage, caused casualties. The 4 other Kai-10 missed, failed to hit, detonated harmlessly, killed pilots for nothing. The submarine escaped, survived mission, was one of few Kai-10 carrying submarines that survived. Most were sunk, most crews died. The missions that killed Kai-10 pilots reliably, killed submarine crews frequently. The desperation missions, the suicide missions, the waste of submarines, waste of crews, waste of young men who piloted Kai-10 to their deaths. The final madness of campaign that had failed, that was destroying itself, that was consuming its own personnel, its own submarines, its own future, for minimal gain, for propaganda value more than military value, for appearance of fighting, for something to report, for nothing real, for nothing meaningful, for nothing worth the cost. The end came gradually. The submarines that remained in May 1945 were few, were damaged, were without adequate fuel, were without adequate crews, were in ports that were being bombed, were unable to operate effectively, were finished as fighting force, were survivors not through capability, through luck, through chance, through happening to be in port when fuel ran out, when crews couldn't be replaced, when damage couldn't be repaired, when operations became impossible. The submarines sat in port, damaged, inactive, waiting for war to end, waiting for defeat, waiting for surrender. The force that had numbered over 100 submarines at peak, that had been one of the world's largest, was reduced to fewer than 20 operational boats, was destroyed, was annihilated, was finished. The submarines at sea, when surrender came, were ordered to surface, were ordered to display flags, were ordered to identify themselves, were ordered to await instructions. Some submarines received orders, obeyed, surfaced, displayed flags, were boarded by Allied forces, were escorted to ports, were captured, were taken. The crews became prisoners, survived. The submarines that obeyed, that surrendered, that survived to end, were minority, were few, were lucky. Other submarines didn't receive orders, didn't know war had ended, continued operations, continued patrols, were detected, were attacked, were sunk. After war ended, after fighting stopped, after surrender was announced, were sunk because Allied forces didn't know war ended, because communication hadn't reached all units, because submarines were enemies until confirmed otherwise. The submarines sunk after surrender, after war was over, the crews killed after fighting ended, the deaths that were unnecessary, that were tragic, that were waste, that were final casualties. The submarines that survived war, but not peace, that died in final days, in final hours, after war should have ended for them, the tragedy that compounded tragedy, the waste that added to waste, the deaths that were final, that were unnecessary, that were bitter, that were wrong. The submarine I-58 survived the war, was in port when surrender came, was damaged, was barely operational, was one of approximately 20 submarines that survived, that remained, that were present at surrender. The submarine that had conducted multiple patrols, that had survived multiple years, that had been lucky, that had avoided the 80%, that had been exception, that had survived when most died. The submarine was taken by allies, was examined, was studied, was eventually scuttled, was sent to bottom deliberately, joined the submarines that had been sunk in combat, joined the silent fleet, joined the graves beneath ocean, the submarine that survived war, that was destroyed in peace. That ended same way, on ocean floor, as tomb, as monument, as memory. The accounting was complete with surrender. 174 submarines commissioned during war, 139 lost during war, approximately 80% attrition, approximately 10,000 submariners killed. The force that began war as one of world's largest submarine forces. That ended war as one of smallest. That was destroyed. That was annihilated. That failed strategically. That died tactically. That accomplished minimal military value. That cost enormous human price. The campaign that was comprehensive failure. That was total waste. That killed 10,000 men. That destroyed 139 submarines. That achieved almost nothing. That is forgotten mostly, that is unknown widely, that disappeared from history, that disappeared like submarines disappeared beneath waves. The campaign that ended, the force that was destroyed, the submariners that died, the submarines that sank, the final patrols that were final, the last missions that ended in death, the end that came, that concluded, that finished, the submarines that didn't return, the 80%, the 139, the 10,000 dead, the final patrol, the final descent, the final darkness, the submarines that remained beneath waves, that remain there still, that are there now, that will be there forever, the final patrol that was final, the submarines that didn't return, the crews that died, the graves that remain, beneath Pacific, in darkness, in depth, in silence. Forever. The Pacific Ocean is vast, covers nearly half the Earth's surface. The submarines that sank are scattered across this vastness. 139 submarines in different locations, different depths, different circumstances, but all beneath the surface, all on the ocean floor, all graves, all monuments, all memories, all evidence of what happened, of what was lost, of who died. The submarines are still there. The crews are still inside mostly. The steel still holds them, still contains them, still entombs them. The ocean keeps them, keeps the submarines, keeps the dead, keeps the memory, keeps the evidence, keeps what happened from completely disappearing, from being completely forgotten. 80 years have passed. The war ended in 1945. The submarines sank between 41 and 45. The time has been long. The veterans are gone, all gone now. The submariners who survived are dead of age. The families who mourned are mostly gone. The generation that knew is passing. The direct memory is fading, is nearly extinguished. Soon no one will remain who knew submariners personally, who waited for submarines that didn't return, who mourned the disappeared, who grieved the lost. The direct memory will be gone, will exist only in records, in documents, in histories, in stories that are passed down, but not in living memory, not in personal connection, not in direct knowledge. The separation is occurring, the distance is growing, the memory is becoming historical rather than personal, is becoming abstract rather than immediate, is becoming forgotten rather than remembered. The number remains. 80%, 139 submarines out of 174. The statistic is stark, is evidence of catastrophe, is proof of systematic destruction, is demonstration of how submarine force was annihilated. The number doesn't change, won't change. Is historical fact, is documented reality, is what happened. The 80% that didn't return, that died, that sank, that became graves beneath ocean, the number that defines the campaign, that characterizes the experience, that shows the cost. The 80% that was too high, that was unsustainable, that was evidence of failure, of waste, of catastrophe. The number that remains, that testifies, that proves, that remembers. Even when people forget, the submarines rest in darkness, in cold, in silence. The depth is absolute. The pressure is enormous. The environment is hostile to everything except steel and stone and things that don't live. The submarines exist in an environment where nothing else exists, where no light penetrates, where no sound carries, where time moves differently, where decay is slow, where change is gradual, where the submarines will rest for centuries, for millennia perhaps, until the steel corrodes completely, until the submarines cease to exist, until the graves collapse, until the ocean reclaims everything. But not yet. Not for a long time yet. The submarines exist, the steel holds, the graves remain, the dead rest, the monuments stand, unseen, unknown, but present, but real, but there. The forgetting is nearly complete. The campaign is barely known, the submarines are barely remembered, the submariners are barely acknowledged. The sacrifice is barely recognized. The strategic failure is barely studied. The human cost is barely understood. The forgetting that began during the war, that continued after, that accelerated with time, is approaching completion, is approaching erasure, is approaching absence. The campaign that killed 10,000 men, that destroyed 139 submarines, that failed completely strategically, is forgotten, is unknown, is absent from memory. The forgetting is comprehensive, is nearly total, is wrong, is unjust, is erasure of service, of sacrifice, of death, of 10,000 lives, of 139 submarines, of 80% that didn't return. The forgetting should not be complete, should not be total, should not erase what happened, who died, what was lost. Rest now. The submarines rest. The submariners rest. The ocean keeps them, holds them, preserves them partially. The steel tombs remain beneath Pacific. The graves are unmarked, are unvisited, are unknown mostly. But are there, are real, are monuments, are memory, are evidence, are what remains of Japan's silent fleet, of 139 submarines that didn't return, of 10,000 submariners who died beneath the waves, of 80% that was lost, that was destroyed, that was wasted, that is remembered here, that is acknowledged here, that is honored here, the submarines that descended into darkness, that never return to light, that remain in depths, that are graves, that are tombs, that are monuments, that are memory, the submariners who served, who fought, who died, who are buried beneath ocean, who rest in steel, who are remembered, who are acknowledged, who are honored, the silent fleet, the disappeared submarines, the lost crews, the 80%, the 139, the 10,000, are remembered, are known, are acknowledged, here, now, by us, by anyone who knows this story, who understands this history, who honors this sacrifice. The submarines that didn't return, the submariners who didn't come home, the 80%. Rest now. are remembered, are honored, are known. Finally, completely, the silent tombs beneath the Pacific, the submarines, the crews, the memory, forever.